The morning always began the same way, and Don Esteban had decided sometime in the second year after Carmen died that this was not a comfort, but a sentence. He rose at 4:45, which was when his body stopped pretending to sleep. He put on the same clothes in the same order. Pants first, then the flannel shirt Carmen had darned at both elbows, then his boots, then his belt. Moving through the dark bedroom by memory because he had never bothered to change where anything was kept. The bedroom was as Carmen had arranged it in 1987, when they repainted, and she decided the wardrobe should face east so the wood would not warp in the afternoon heat. She had been right about the wardrobe, and wrong about her own heart, which had stopped during a rainstorm in October of 2018 before either of them had time to say anything that mattered. He was 78 years old. His left knee had been grinding since he turned 72, and he walked with a wooden cane that one of the ranch hands, old Don Aurelio, had cut from a guamuchil branch and smoothed down with sandpaper until it fit the curve of Esteban's palm. He made it from the bedroom to the kitchen in 32 steps. He had counted them once, a year ago, on a night when sleep had abandoned him completely, and he needed something to do with his mind. 32 steps was not far. It had never felt far when Carmen was alive. Now it felt like the distance between one country and another. The kitchen was cold at that hour, and he lit the gas burner with a match because the electronic igniter had broken in March and he had not seen the point in fixing it. He put the coffee pot on, the old aluminum one that made a sound like a small argument when it boiled, and stood at the window while he waited. Outside, the land was still dark, but beginning to differentiate itself from the sky. The outlines of the fence posts and the ceiba tree at the north corner of the yard becoming visible in gradients of gray and blue. 320 hectares of valley floor and hillside, 60 of which were planted in corn, the rest divided between pasture for his 34 head of cattle and the dry scrub that climbed the ridge toward the pine forest. He had bought the first 40 hectares with Carmen at 23 years old, paying for it in 3 installments that nearly destroyed them both financially and made them closer than any easy prosperity could have. The other 280 they had added piece by piece over 48 years, each purchase its own story, its own argument, its own eventual agreement. He poured the coffee into 2 cups. He did not think about why he poured 2 cups. He had done it every morning for 48 years, and his hands had not received the information that things had changed. 1 cup he drank standing at the window. The other he set on the small table beside Carmen's chair, the wooden chair with the woven seat she had brought from her mother's house in 1970 and never once considered replacing. By the time he finished his coffee, hers was cold. He left it there until he went to bed. Each night he poured it out and washed the cup and set it back on the shelf, and each morning he poured it again. This was not grief exactly, or rather, it was grief that had finished the dramatic part of itself and settled into something structural, something load-bearing. He did not cry anymore. He had cried for the first 8 months, alone in the evenings after the ranch hands went home, crying in the blunt and graceless way that men of his generation cried, as if the body were doing something the mind had not approved. Then the crying stopped, and the quiet came in, and the quiet was larger than the crying had been, and did not have the same release. Don Aurelio came each day at 6 to help with the cattle, and Jacinto, who was 59 and had worked the land since he was 17, came to manage the corn. They were good men, both of them, and they said little and worked hard and did not look at him with pity, which he appreciated more than he had words to express. They ate their lunch at the table outside the barn, and sometimes they talked about the rain or the price of corn at the cooperative in Miahuatlan, and sometimes they did not talk at all. And both kinds of days were acceptable. They went home at 5. By 5:15, the ranch was his alone again. 320 hectares of land and 1 man who needed a cane to cross his own kitchen. He had a nephew somewhere in the city, or rather a cousin's son, Rodrigo, whom he had met perhaps 4 times in the last 15 years, always at funerals. He had an older sister in Tehuantepec who was 81 and in worse health than he was. He had the priest, Padre Isidro, who came to the ranch every 2 months to check on him and stayed for lunch and talked about the ejido water rights and the state of the road, which had been in bad condition since the rains of the previous year. He had the land. He had 34 cattle and 2 ranch hands and an aluminum coffee pot and a chair with a woven seat and a locked door at the end of the hallway that he had not opened in 6 years. The door led to Carmen's sewing room. She had called it her study, though she never studied anything formal in there. She read, she sewed, she kept her accounts. She sat in the evenings with the window open and let the night air come in while she worked on whatever she was working on. When she died, she had been in the middle of a wool tapete, a weaving she had started in August and planned to finish before Christmas. The loom was still in there, with the half-finished tapeta threaded and waiting. He had gone in once, the week after the funeral, to look at it. Then he had locked the door and put the key on his keychain, where it pressed against his thigh every day like a word he could not bring himself to say out loud. He had thought, in the first years, that someone would come, a relative perhaps, or a neighbor's child who needed work and would become necessary over time. He had thought, more vaguely, that things would arrange themselves into some shape that made sense. They had not. The land continued, and the cattle continued, and the coffee continued, and the locked door continued, and nothing arranged itself into anything but exactly what it was. An old man with a good piece of land, and no one to leave it to, and no particular reason to leave it to anyone, now that the person for whom everything had been built was gone. It was a Thursday in November when the woman appeared at the gate. He saw her from the cornfield, where he had walked out after lunch to check the irrigation ditch that Jacinto had said was beginning to silt. He walked slowly, leaning into the cane, and by the time he reached the edge of the field and looked toward the road, she was already standing at the gate. Not knocking, not calling out, just standing there, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to do something difficult and is giving herself a moment before she does it. He watched her for a few seconds before she saw him. She was a woman of perhaps 35 or 40 years old. He would learn later she was 38, and she was wearing a dark blue dress and carrying a canvas bag on one shoulder. Behind her, arranged in a line so natural and practiced it spoke of long roads and difficult circumstances, were 3 children. The oldest was a boy, thin and serious, perhaps 12 or 13, with a backpack that was clearly full and a posture that said he had been carrying things for some time. Behind him was a girl, younger, perhaps 8 or 9, with a notebook tucked under her arm and her hair in 2 braids that had come partially undone. And at the end, holding the girl's hand and looking at the ceiba tree with the uncomplicated fascination of a very young child, was a boy who could not have been more than 4 years old. What struck Don Esteban before anything else was that the woman was standing straight. She had walked, he would discover, 28 kilometers from the town of Miahuatlan, carrying the bag and the youngest child in turns, and she was standing at his gate as though she had arrived from somewhere close and unremarkable. He had seen many people come to this gate over the years, buyers for the cattle, neighbors asking to borrow equipment, salesmen from the agricultural cooperative in the valley, and he could usually tell from 20 meters what kind of conversation was coming. He could not tell with this woman. She was looking at the house with an expression he could not read, not desperate and not calculating, something more like careful. He opened the gate from the inside when he reached it. She turned and looked at him directly, which some people did not do, with older men especially, and said, "Good afternoon. Are you Don Esteban Ruiz?" "I am," he said. She took a breath that was not quite a sigh. "My name is Marisol Vega. My husband died 14 months ago in a construction accident in the valley. I have 3 children, and we have been staying with my aunt in Miahuatlan, but that situation is no longer possible." She did not elaborate on why the situation was no longer possible, and he did not ask. "I have heard from people in the town that you live alone on this land and that you have no family here." "I do not know if what I heard is true." "It is true enough," he said. She looked at him steadily. You have no one to take care of you, Señor, and my children have no grandfather. Let us stay. I will work for what we eat. My son is 13 and works hard. My daughter is 9, and she is useful. The little one is 4, and he will not cause trouble. She paused. I am not asking for charity. I am proposing a trade.
Don Esteban stood at the gate of his own land and felt something happen in his chest that he could not immediately identify. It was not pity. He did not feel pity for her, which was part of what was strange, because she had not offered him anything to pity. It was more like recognition, the feeling of hearing a word in your own language after a long time in a foreign country. She had looked at his life, the empty land, the 2 coffee cups, the locked door, all of it. And she had named it out loud without flinching, and she was offering him something in return for something else, and there was no performance of suffering in any of it, only the plain and difficult reality of 2 people who were each missing exactly what the other had too much of. He looked at the boy who was looking back at him with dark, serious eyes. He looked at the girl who was looking at the ceiba tree. He looked at the small boy who had transferred his attention from the tree to Don Esteban's cane and was studying it with professional intensity. What is your son's name? He said. Tomás, she said. The girl is Lucia. The little one is Alberto, but we call him Beto. He looked at the sky, which was beginning to go orange above the ridge. It would be dark in an hour and a half. He looked back at her, and she was still standing straight, which he noticed again, and which seemed to him the most important thing he had observed all day. Come inside, he said. I will hear the rest of it over coffee. He turned and walked toward the house, and after a moment he heard 4 sets of footsteps on the gravel behind him, and the small voice of the boy Beto saying to his sister in a tone of great scientific interest, His stick has a face. The cane did not have a face. Don Aurelio had simply carved a slight curve into the top of it that apparently resembled something to a 4-year-old. Don Esteban did not turn around. He did not say yes that night. He made coffee and set out bread and the hard cheese he kept for himself, and he listened to Marisol explain their situation, the accident, the months in Miahuatlan, the particular deterioration of an arrangement that had been temporary from the beginning. And he listened to her describe what she was offering, which was labor, cooking, cleaning, managing the household, working in the garden, whatever the land required. Tomás, she said, was good with numbers and had already helped manage accounts at his uncle's hardware store in the valley. Lucia was good with her hands. The little one would learn. Don Esteban asked questions. He asked them the way he asked questions about cattle or about water rights, directly, without softening them. He asked about debts. He asked about the husband's family. He asked whether there was anyone looking for her or expecting something from her. She answered each question in the same tone she had used at the gate, without defensiveness, without elaboration beyond what was necessary, without any appeal to his emotions that he could detect. By 8 o'clock, the children were asleep. Beto curled in Marisol's lap, and Tomás and Lucia on the bench along the kitchen wall, leaning against each other with the practiced sleep of children who had slept in difficult places before. Don Esteban looked at them for a moment, and then looked at the table. I would give you my answer in the morning, he said. That is fair, she said. She did not thank him. He respected that. He went to bed at 8:30, which was an hour earlier than usual. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word trade and what it implied, and about the boy with the serious eyes who had looked back at him without looking away, and about the small one who had asked, when Marisol was putting him to sleep, where the bathroom was. And Don Esteban had told him, and the boy had said, Gracias, señor, with the careful formality of a child who had been taught to say it that way. He did not decide anything that night. He simply lay there, and for the first time in 6 years, the house did not feel completely empty while he was trying to sleep. He told her yes in the morning before he had finished his first cup of coffee. He had not planned to do it so early. He had imagined something more deliberate, sitting across from her at the table, laying out the conditions clearly, the way he would discuss terms with a supplier or a buyer. Instead, he came out of the bedroom at 4:45, as always, and found the kitchen light on and Marisol already at the stove, not doing anything dramatic, only heating water and slicing the bread she had not eaten the night before. She looked up when he came in and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. He sat down. She set a cup in front of him without being asked. He drank half of it before he spoke. "There are 3 rooms at the back," he said. "You and the girl can take the larger one, the boys in the smaller one beside it. There is 1 bathroom for those rooms, and you will find everything you need in the cabinet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gracias, Don Esteban." "There are rules," he said. "Tell me the rules," he told her. He told her that he rose at 4:45, and he did not want noise in the house before 5:30. He told her that the hallway past the kitchen, the one with the locked door at the end, was not to be explored or asked about. He told her that the ranch hands, Don Aurelio and Jacinto, were to be treated with respect and were not to be managed by anyone but him. He told her that the accounts for the ranch were kept in a ledger in the office, which she could see but not touch without his permission. He told her he ate lunch at noon and dinner at 7, and he did not like chili in his eggs. She listened to all of it without interrupting. "And what do you want from us?" she said when he was done. He thought about it. "Honesty," he said. "If something breaks, tell me. If something goes wrong, tell me. If you decide to leave, tell me before you leave, not after." "Agreed," she said. That was the whole of the negotiation. It was the most orderly conversation he had had in 6 years. The first week was not comfortable, and he did not expect it to be. 32 years of living alone, or what felt like 32, though it was only 6, had left him with habits that did not accommodate other people easily. He was accustomed to silence in the mornings. He was accustomed to moving through the house without announcing himself, to leaving things in whatever position was convenient for him alone, to eating at his own pace and thinking his own thoughts, and going to bed when his body said to go to bed. Now there were 4 people in his house, each of whom had needs and schedules and the particular noise that comes with being alive, and the adjustment was not seamless. Beto was the loudest, in the direct and uninhibited way of 4-year-olds who have not yet learned that their volume has an effect on the world. He woke up talking and went to bed talking, and in between he narrated everything around him with the dedication of a man doing important work. He narrated the chickens. He narrated the dog, a large and philosophical animal named Carbon, who had been with Esteban for 9 years and met the new arrivals with the deep suspicion of a dog who had grown accustomed to a predictable life. Beto narrated Carbon with such enthusiasm and frequency that within 3 days the dog had given up resisting and now spent most of his time wherever Beto was, which meant that both of them were usually underfoot in the kitchen. Lucia was quieter, but more observant. She had the habit of watching things, not staring, but taking careful note of what was where and how things worked and why. She watched Don Esteban walk to the barn with his cane and then, without saying anything, asked Don Aurelio if there was a shorter path to the barn from the house. Don Aurelio, who had been watching everything with the quiet amusement of a man who had lived long enough to find most things interesting, showed her the path through the kitchen garden that cut off 6 minutes. She began leaving the back gate open for Don Esteban in the mornings, without comment, which he pretended not to notice. Tomas helped with everything that needed 2 hands or a younger back. He carried feed, mended fences where the wire had come loose, shoveled out the irrigation channel that had silted along its lower third. He did this without being asked and without expecting to be praised for it, which was a quality Don Esteban had valued in adults and had not expected to find in a boy of 13. He did not talk much while he worked.
Once,
when they were together fixing a section of fencing along the north pasture, Tomas said, "The posts on this side are rotting from the bottom. It would be faster to replace them than to try to stabilize them." Don Esteban looked at the posts, which he had known were rotting for 2 seasons but had been putting off because the work required bending, which his knee did not appreciate. "You are right," he said. "We will do it Saturday." Tomas nodded and went back to work. He did not say, "I told you so," in any of the 1,000 small ways that people say it. Don Esteban noticed this too. Marisol managed the house with a competence that was not showy and not loud. She cooked better than he had eaten in 6 years, which was not entirely a compliment to her since he had been eating very badly. She found the kitchen garden behind the house, which he had largely abandoned after Carmen died, and began working it back into usefulness, pulling the overgrown oregano, resetting the tomato stakes, planting a row of yerba santa along the south wall where it would get the afternoon sun. She did the accounts for the household without being asked, keeping a small notebook of what she spent at the market in Miahuatlan on the days she went with Don Aurelio's truck, and presenting it to Don Esteban each Friday without drama, every centavo accounted for. He did not always make it easy. He was short with her sometimes, in the mornings especially. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because he was not accustomed to people in the mornings, and his temper was worst when he was tired. She absorbed this without retreating and without fighting back, which was a more sophisticated response than many adults he had known. She simply waited for his mood to improve, which it always did by mid-morning, and then continued what she had been doing. After 2 weeks, he began to notice that he was waking up at 4:45, and the fact of 4 other people in the house was no longer producing in him the specific anxiety of a man whose solitude has been invaded. It was producing something else, something he did not have a name for yet, and he did not go looking for one. It was on the 8th morning that Beto came out onto the porch. This was Don Esteban's hour, the half hour between when he finished his first coffee and when the light was strong enough to see by, which he spent sitting on the wooden chair on the porch with his second cup and watching the land come into itself. It had been his hour with Carmen, 50 years of the same hour, the two of them not always talking, sometimes just sitting there together with their cups while the sky changed. After she died, it had remained his hour, except that it was not. It was just time passing in a chair. He heard the small footsteps, and then Beto appeared in the porch doorway in a cotton undershirt and shorts, his hair pointing in 4 directions and his expression one of complete wakefulness, as though he had been up for hours rather than seconds. He looked at Don Esteban. He looked at the 2 cups on the small table, the full one that Don Esteban was drinking from, and the other one, Carmen's cup, which Esteban had filled, as always, and set in its place on the right side of the table. Beto came and stood next to the table and looked at the second cup with the serious attention he gave to most things that did not have an obvious explanation. Then he looked up at Don Esteban. "Is that for your friend?" he said. Don Esteban looked at the cup. He looked at it the way he had looked at it every morning for 6 years, as a thing that was and was not there at the same time, a presence and an absence occupying the same 3 inches of table. He had never, in 6 years, been asked about it. Don Aurelio knew about it and said nothing. Jacinto knew and said nothing. Padre Isidro had once looked at it and then looked away very carefully, which was the kindest thing anyone had done. He opened his mouth to say something and found that he had nothing to say. Beto waited a moment, decided the question had been answered adequately or not at all, and climbed up into Carmen's chair, the wooden chair with the woven seat that no one had sat in since October of 2018, with the pragmatic efficiency of a 4-year-old who sees an empty chair and requires a place to sit. He sat there, both feet dangling, and looked out at the land with the same expression Don Esteban used when he sat in that same spot, not looking at anything in particular, and looking at everything. They sat like that until the light came up, without speaking. After a while, Beto said, "There are birds on the fence," in the tone of an observation that required no response. And Don Esteban said, Yes. And they watched the birds on the fence together. When Marisol came out 20 minutes later, she found them both sitting there and started to reach for Beto to take him inside, and Don Esteban said, without looking at her, "He is fine." She withdrew her hand and went back to the kitchen. It was, he thought afterward, the longest he had sat on that porch without the second cup of coffee bothering him. Which was perhaps not what bothered him about it after all. The ledger issue happened on a Tuesday in the third week. Don Esteban kept his accounts in a large green ledger that had been replaced 11 times since 1978 and always looked exactly the same because he bought the same kind every time from the same shop in Miahuatlan. The ranch accounts, feed costs, veterinary expenses, cattle sales, corn cooperative payouts, were recorded by month and year in his own handwriting, which was small and precise, and had changed very little since he was 40. Don Aurelio also kept a secondary notebook of daily expenses, which he brought to Don Esteban each Friday for transfer into the main ledger. Tomas had been helping Don Aurelio with the daily notebook for 2 weeks, writing down the figures that Don Aurelio dictated because Don Aurelio's handwriting had become difficult to read as his hands had stiffened. On the Tuesday in question, Tomas came into the office where Don Esteban was sitting with the main ledger and said, without preamble, "Don Esteban, I think there is an error in the accounts." Don Esteban looked up. "What kind of error?" "The corn cooperative paid out on the 14th of September, October, and November," Tomas said. "But in the ledger, the September payout is recorded twice, once on the 14th and once on the 17th, and the October one is missing entirely." He set the secondary notebook on the desk beside the ledger and pointed to the relevant entries with the careful precision of someone who has checked his work before presenting it. Don Esteban looked at the ledger. He looked at the secondary notebook. He looked at both of them for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "Sit down." Tomas sat. Don Esteban went through the entries again himself, cross-referencing the cooperative's payment slips, which he kept in a folder in the top drawer. It took 15 minutes. Tomas sat quietly and did not speak, and did not look impatient, which Don Esteban noted with the part of his mind that was always noting things about how people behaved under scrutiny. The boy was right. The September payment had been recorded twice, creating a phantom surplus, and the October payment had been missed entirely, creating a phantom deficit. The net effect over the quarter was a discrepancy of 8,400 pesos that had been folded into the year-end figures without anyone catching it. Don Esteban sat back in his chair. He said nothing for a moment. He was not angry at Don Aurelio, who had been keeping these books faithfully for 30 years, and whose hands had been giving him trouble, and who was, in any case, 67 years old and owed no man a perfect accounting record. He was, and this was harder to name, something between grateful and unsettled. The feeling of having been given something you needed by someone whose giving of it you had not anticipated. "What is your full name?" he said. The boy looked slightly surprised. "Tomas Aurelio Vega Reyes." "Tomas Aurelio," Don Esteban repeated. "After your father?" "After my father's father," he said. "My father was called Hector." Don Esteban nodded. He picked up a pen and began correcting the ledger, making the changes in red ink as he always did for corrections, noting the date and the reason in the margin. He said, without looking up, "Starting next month, you will help me with the monthly entries. Don Aurelio will give you the daily notebook on Thursdays instead of Fridays, so you have time to organize it before I do the transfers. If you find something that doesn't match, you bring it to me the same day. Don't sit on it." "Yes, senor," Tomas said. "And tell Don Aurelio," Don Esteban added, "that I said his notebooks are very clear, because they are. He just made a mistake, and mistakes are different from being unclear." Tomas nodded and left. Don Esteban finished correcting the ledger and then sat for a moment with his pen in his hand, looking at the red ink, thinking that the boy was 13 years old and had walked into his office and told him about an error in his own accounts without any nervousness that he could detect.
and that this was either a quality the boy was born with or a quality that circumstances had required of him, and that in either case it was not a quality to waste. Outside the window he could hear Beto in the yard, explaining something at length to Carbone. The dog's silence in response had the quality of genuine attention. Some lives, Don Esteban thought, had a way of filling themselves back in when you weren't looking. He was not certain yet whether that was happening or whether he was mistaken about what he was seeing. But he closed the ledger with the corrections made, and the corrections felt, for the first time in a long time, like the start of something, rather than simply the maintenance of what already existed. By the end of the first month, no one was counting days anymore. By the end of the second month, Don Aurelio had stopped looking at the newcomers with the watchful neutrality of a man waiting for something to go wrong, and had started telling Tomas things about the cattle that he had never bothered to tell Don Esteban. Not because Don Esteban didn't know them, but because Don Esteban had always known them and did not need them explained. To explain things to someone who did not know them yet was a different kind of work, the kind Don Aurelio seemed to find satisfying in his quieter moments. He showed Tomas how to read the condition of a cow by the quality of its coat and the brightness of its eyes, and Tomas listened with the focused attention of someone taking notes even when he had nothing to write on. Lucia helped Marisol in the kitchen and the garden, and sometimes disappeared for an hour with her notebook, drawing the cedar trees along the eastern fence, Carbone sleeping in the sun, the pattern of stones along the irrigation ditch. Don Esteban found one of her drawings left on the kitchen table one afternoon, a careful, precise sketch of the porch with the 2 chairs and the 2 cups on the small table, drawn from the yard as if the artist had been standing outside looking in, and he stood with it in his hand for longer than he intended to, looking at what a 9-year-old girl had seen when she looked at his morning. He set it back on the table and did not mention it, but he did not throw it away either. The door at the end of the hallway remained locked through November and December, and into January, and Don Esteban had not decided anything about it except that it would remain locked for as long as he decided nothing. He was aware that Lucia had noticed it. She was a noticer by nature, the kind of child whose attention missed very little, and a locked door in a house was a fact that demanded at least an internal question. She had not asked about it directly, not after he had told them on that first morning that the hallway was not for exploring. She had, however, looked at the door every time she passed it, which was 3 or 4 times a day, with a look that was curious but not greedy, the kind of look that said she was filing the door away rather than trying to open it. What opened the conversation, in the end, was a ball of yarn. In the 3rd week of January, Marisol was rearranging the kitchen cabinet to make better use of the space. She had a gift for arrangement, for finding the way things could fit together more efficiently than they currently did, and she found, pushed to the back of the 2nd shelf behind a tin of piloncillo that had gone hard, a small woven basket containing 4 balls of wool yarn in dark red and terracotta and a natural cream color, along with 2 wooden needles and a crochet hook that had been set there and forgotten at some point in the preceding years. She set the basket on the table, intending to ask Don Esteban where he wanted it moved, but it was Lucia who saw it first, coming in from the garden with dirt on her knees and her notebook in her hand, and stopped in front of the table the way she stopped in front of things that interested her. "Can I have this?" she said, picking up the crochet hook. "That's for Don Esteban to say," Marisol told her. But Don Esteban had come in from the porch while this was happening and was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he was looking at the basket with the basket looked at, with the specific expression of someone seeing something they had looked for and lost, and then found somewhere entirely unexpected. His expression was not distress, exactly. It was more like the feeling of biting into something and tasting a flavor you had not tasted in a very long time, and your body recognizing it before your mind does. "That is your abuela's?" Lucia asked him, with the directness of a 9-year-old who had decided the question was important enough to ask, even though she knew it might not be welcome. "My wife's," he said. "She kept her sewing things everywhere, in every cabinet, every drawer. She always said she needed her things close to her hands." He paused.
She said, if you have to walk to get your tools, the moment has already passed.
Lucia looked at the yarn.
Can I use the hook? I know how to crochet. My grandmother taught me.
Don Esteban looked at her for a moment. He looked at the hook, which was a simple wooden one that Carmen had bought at the market in Miahuatlan many years ago. Nothing special. The kind of tool that exists in every household in the valley. Then he said, "You know how to use it properly?" "Yes," said Lucia, with the confidence of someone who does. "Then you may borrow it," he said, "but return it to the basket when you are done." She nodded and took the hook and went to sit at the table, and Don Esteban picked up the basket and stood there with it in his hands for a moment before setting it back on the cabinet shelf. Marisol watched him and said nothing. She had a talent for understanding when silence was the better response. That evening, Lucia was sitting on the porch with the crochet hook and the skein of her mother's cotton thread, working on something small and determined. And Don Esteban came out with his after-dinner coffee and sat in his chair and watched her work. She had good technique. The hook moved with the confidence of someone who had been shown properly, not the tentative movement of a child guessing at a skill. After a while, he said, "What are you making?"
I don't know yet,
she said.
Sometimes I start, and then I see what it wants to be.
He drank his coffee and thought about that. My wife worked that way, he said. She said she couldn't plan things like that because plans were for people who already knew what they wanted, and she never knew until she was already in the middle of it. Lucia looked up at him. She sounds like me, she said, without vanity, as a simple observation. A little, he said. There was a silence that was comfortable rather than empty, which was a different kind of silence than he had been living in for 6 years. He finished his coffee. He did not pour it out before going inside, as he sometimes did. The door came up, inevitably, one Saturday afternoon when Lucia was helping him carry things from the storage room to the porch for the inventory he did each January, counting sacks, checking equipment, making the list for the agricultural supplier in February. They passed the locked door twice, and on the second pass, Lucia stopped and looked at it and said, "What is in there, Don Esteban?" "My wife's room," he said. She looked at the door and then at him with the expression of someone who is considering whether the next question is permitted. "She made things in there?" "She made everything in there," he said. "She sewed, she wove. She made 3 rugs for this house and the tapete that used to be in the sala before it wore out." He found himself speaking carefully, the way you speak when you are handling something that has been in one position for a long time and you are not certain how moving it will affect it. When she died, she had one on the loom, half done. I have not opened the door since. Lucia was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid it will be sad?" He considered this seriously. "I know it will be sad," he said. "I am waiting to find out if I am ready for that particular kind of sad." She nodded as though this made perfect sense to her, which perhaps it did. She picked up the storage box she had been carrying and continued to the porch, and he followed, and the door remained closed. But the fact of having said those words out loud, "I am waiting to find out if I am ready," produced in him a small, internal shift, like a stone being moved a fraction of an inch. Not removed, just slightly repositioned. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and thought about the tapete on the loom, which was woven in red and terracotta and cream, colors he could remember but not quite see anymore. The way you can remember the sound of a voice but not quite hear it. Carmen had been planning to give it to his sister in Tehuantepec for Christmas. She had shown it to him in September, half done, and he had said it was beautiful, which was true, and she had said she would have it finished by December, which she had not. He rose at his usual hour and went to the kitchen, and the key was on his keychain, and after he had drunk his first cup of coffee, he went to the door. He stood in front of it for 4 minutes. He counted them this time. Then he went back to the kitchen and got Lucia. She was awake. She was always awake early, like him, though for different reasons, and she came with him down the hallway without asking any questions, which was exactly right. He put the key in the lock and turned it, and opened the door and stepped back. The room smelled of dust and cedar and something else he could not name, which was perhaps just the particular smell of absence. The smell of a room that has been unchanged for a long time. Carmen's loom stood against the left wall, a large floor loom, old, one they had bought from a weaver in Teotitlan del Valle in 1989 and transported in pieces in the back of the truck. The tapete was still threaded, the unfinished portion hanging between the loom's beams, and the colors were exactly as he had remembered them. Deep red, terracotta, cream, in the diamond pattern that Carmen had learned from her own mother, and that she said was very old, older than anyone alive could remember beginning. He did not go further into the room. He stood in the doorway. Lucia walked in slowly, not touching anything, looking at the loom with an expression he had never seen on a child before. The expression of someone recognizing something they did not know they had been looking for. She stood in front of the tapete and looked at it for a long time. "How much is done?" she said at last. "About half," he said. She was going to finish it by Christmas. Lucia reached out and touched, very gently, the edge of the woven portion. "The wool is still good," she said. "It's been kept dry. It hasn't rotted." Don Esteban said nothing. "Could someone finish it?" she asked, still looking at the tapete. He had thought about that in the 6 years. He had thought about it and then set the thought aside because it required him to think about what finishing it would mean, and also about who could do it, and also about whether finishing it was the right thing or whether leaving it the way it was preserved something that completing it would end. "I don't know," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I could learn," she said. "If someone taught me how the pattern works." He looked at her. She was 9 years old and small for her age, and she was standing in a room he had not entered in 6 years, in front of a loom that had belonged to the person who was the center of his world for 48 years. And she was offering to finish what that person had started, not because she had thought about what it meant, but because she saw something that needed doing, and she had the hands for it. He had to look away for a moment. "We will see," he said, which was not no. He locked the door again when they left, but he left the key in a different place on his keychain, between the truck key and the gate key, where his thumb found it more easily. The crisis came in the last week of February, in the pre-dawn dark, in the barn. Don Esteban had developed the habit of checking on the cattle once in the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, when his sleep was lightest. It was not something the veterinarian from the cooperative had recommended. It was something he did, because the dark hours of the barn had a quality of calm that he had always found useful when his mind was too full for sleep. And because in 40 years of raising cattle, he had found twice that the things which killed animals happened at night, in the hours when no one was watching. And he had lost 20,000 pesos and a good breeding bull to those hours, and he had decided not to lose to them again. He went to the barn at 2:40 in the morning on a Tuesday, moving slowly with his cane on the uneven ground between the house and the barn, and he was checking the water troughs when his left knee gave way. It had given way before, twice in the preceding year, once on the road and once in the kitchen. But both times he had been near something to catch himself on. This time he was between the 3rd and 4th stalls and there was nothing near enough. And he went down on his right side on the packed dirt floor, and the cane went sideways, and he could not get up. He was not injured, or not seriously. His hip was bruised and his wrist had caught some of the impact, but nothing was broken. What he could not do was stand. His left knee, which he had been managing with pain and stubbornness and a wooden cane for 6 years, had decided at 2:40 in the morning in the barn to simply stop cooperating. And no amount of will or leverage was sufficient to change this without something to hold on to that was not available. He could call for help. He had no telephone with him. He had never seen the point of carrying it to the barn, a decision he revised immediately and permanently. And the house was 40 meters away, and the barn walls were thick, and his voice, at 78 in the middle of the night, would not carry what he needed it to carry. So he lay on his side on the barn floor, which smelled of hay and cattle and damp earth, and he waited. He was not afraid, exactly. He was angry. In the deep and quiet way, he was angry at things he could not argue with. At the knee, at the dark, at the distance of 40 meters, at the fact that this was a thing he should have anticipated and had not. He lay there with the cattle moving around him in their slow nocturnal way, and he thought about the morning, which was 3 hours away, and about what would happen if it was cold tonight, which it was, and about the fact that there was no one who would come. And then the cattle began to move. It was not unusual for cattle to move in the night. They shifted, they resettled. They had their own rhythms that he knew well. But this was a different quality of movement, a collective unease, the specific sound of animals who have detected something outside their ordinary experience and are registering it the only way they know how. 3 of them moved to the south wall, and one began a low, persistent sound, not quite a moo, more of a vocalization of concern. 40 meters away in the house, Marisol heard it. He found out later that she had woken at 3 in the morning because Beto had kicked her in his sleep, which he did regularly, and she had lain awake listening to the night sounds of the ranch, which she had been learning as you learn any new language, by immersion, until each sound had a name and a meaning. The cattle sound was not one she had heard before, not at that hour, not with that quality, and she was outside and crossing the yard before she had finished deciding to go. She found him on the barn floor, lying on his side, covered in his coat because he had pulled it over himself in the cold. She came down beside him, and he said, before she could speak, "I am not hurt. My knee gave out. I cannot get up without something to hold." She looked at him for a moment, and the quality of her look was not pity and not panic, only attention, the look of someone assessing a problem. She went to the stall railing on his right side and pushed it with both hands to test its solidity, then came back and positioned herself and said, "Hold here and here, and when I say push, push with your right side." He did what she said. It took 3 attempts, and he was breathing hard at the end of it, but he was standing, his hand on the railing and her shoulder under his right arm at the moment when the weight was highest. He did not thank her. He was not certain how to, and he suspected she did not want to be thanked for it in any case. They walked back to the house slowly, her at his left side without touching him unless he needed it, and he needed it twice. She got him to the kitchen table and made coffee without asking if he wanted it. He sat there while she made it and felt the adrenaline leaving his body and leaving behind it something else. A clear and uncomplicated fact that had the force of something which had always been true, but which he had only just seen from the right angle. She sat across from him with her own cup. Neither of them spoke for a while. He said finally, "Why were you awake?" "Beto kicked me," she said. He looked at the kitchen table. "I will buy a telephone that I carry with me," he said, "tomorrow." "That would be sensible," she said. They drank their coffee. The sky outside began, very slowly, to change. She never spoke about that night as something she had done for him. Not to the children, not to Don Aurelio, not to anyone he could tell. She did not file it under any category of debt or service or proof of loyalty. It was simply a thing that had happened in the night, and the morning came after, and the work of the morning went on. He called the doctor in Miahuatlan after breakfast and went down with Jacinto to have the knee examined. The doctor told him what he had expected. The joint was not going to improve. It had deteriorated to the point where the options were surgery, which he declined because he was 78 and did not see the point of surgery, or management, which meant a better cane, more rest, and not walking alone in the dark on uneven ground. He bought the telephone that afternoon, a simple one, and put Marisol's number as the first entry. She had been in his house for 3 months. He had stopped thinking of her as a temporary arrangement sometime in the second month without noticing when it happened. The tapete came up again the following Saturday. He did not plan to bring it up. He found himself standing in front of the locked door in the hallway, and the key was in his hand, and he could not say with certainty how it had gotten there. He opened the door. He went to the loom. He stood in front of the half-finished tapete for a long time, and then he went to find Lucia. She was in the kitchen garden with her notebook, drawing the Hierba Santa, and she came when he called without asking why. They stood together in front of the loom, and he explained the pattern to her as best he could, which was not completely, because Carmen had never formally taught him, and he had only watched. But he knew the logic of it, the way the diamonds nested, the way the colors alternated. Lucia listened and looked and asked one question, which was a precise question about the heddle, and Don Esteban answered it as best he could, and said he would call the woman in Teotitlan del Valle who had sold them the loom and ask her to come and show the girl properly.
Do you want me to finish it?
Lucia asked him, looking at the tapete. I want you to learn how first, he said, and then we will decide. She nodded. She ran her finger along the edge of the woven portion, following the line of a diamond pattern, and she said, It's beautiful. Yes, he said. She was. He did not mean to say she instead of it. He closed the room carefully, and this time he left the door unlocked. He went to Miahuatlan on a Wednesday in March, alone, on the 8 o'clock bus. He told Marisol he was going to the cooperative to discuss the spring corn sale. This was true as far as it went. He did not tell her the other thing he was going to do, not because he was hiding it, but because some decisions are finished before they are spoken, and this one was still in the last part of its finishing. The bus was an hour each way, and he sat by the window with his cane between his knees and watched the valley go by, the dry hillsides and the scattered houses and the road that he had driven so many times in 40 years that he knew its particular quality of turning and its potholes, and its 3 excellent views of the valley floor as it descended. The cooperative took an hour. He ate a torta at the counter of the small comedor beside the market, sitting on a stool with his hat on the counter, and then he walked 3 blocks to the office of Licenciada Pilar Morales Guzman, who had been the best lawyer in Miahuatlan for 30 years, and who was the person you went to when you wanted something done properly. He had called her the week before. He had told her briefly what he wanted, and she had said she would have the documents ready, and they would need 2 witnesses, which she could arrange. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon and sat in the chair across from her desk, which was large and covered in organized stacks of paper, and she was a woman of 62, with reading glasses she wore on the end of her nose, and an expression of complete professional neutrality that he found deeply reassuring. She laid out the documents. He had asked for a labor agreement with inheritance provisions, which was a specific instrument under Mexican law, not a simple will, not a gift, but an agreement recognizing the services provided by an employee and establishing a form of compensation that extended beyond the employment period. What he wanted was this: that after 5 years of honest work on the ranch, the land and property would pass to Marisol Vega and her children in equal portions, with Tomas as the administrative trustee if Marisol died before the children came of age. There was a clause specifying that the agreement was compensation for services rendered and services to be rendered, and that it was in no way a gift or act of charity, a point Don Esteban had been specific about in his telephone conversation, and that the Licenciada had written into the preamble with the care it deserved. Licenciada Morales read the provisions to him slowly, because his reading glasses had broken in February, and he had not replaced them yet. He listened to each clause and asked questions about 2 of them. The witnesses were the Licenciada's secretary and a notary from the next office who came in smelling of fresh coffee and signed without much ceremony. Don Esteban signed with his full name, which was Esteban Francisco Ruiz Carrasco, in the handwriting that had not changed since he was 40, and the licenciada stamped the document and gave him 2 copies in a manila envelope. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not tell Marisol that evening. He did not tell her the following day either. He put the envelope in the top drawer of the office desk under the green ledger, and he thought about when and whether to tell her. And he decided that the right moment would present itself, and he would recognize it when it did. The right moment came 10 days later, and he did not choose it. He was in the office with Tomas doing the March accounts. They had settled into a rhythm by now, Tomas bringing the organized notebook on Thursdays and the 2 of them going through the entries together on Friday mornings, which had become a standing appointment of the kind that neither of them would have called important, but that both of them, he suspected, valued. Don Esteban had begun explaining the logic of certain transactions as they went, why the breeding bull purchases were depreciated over 4 years, why the corn cooperative payments needed to be tracked separately from the cattle income, why it mattered to know the difference between a cash expense and a credit one. Tomas asked questions with the precision of someone who had already thought about the answer and was testing his own thinking against someone else's. On this particular Friday, after they finished the accounts, Tomas said with the slight hesitation of someone who has been considering something for several days,
Don Esteban, may I ask you something?
"Ask," he said.
My mother,
Tomas said.
she has been here 4 months. She works every day, and she has never asked you for anything, except what she said at the gate.
He paused.
I want to know if she is safe here. If we are safe here.
Don Esteban looked at him. The boy was 13, which meant he remembered clearly the year before, and the year his father died, and the 14 months of uncertainty that had followed. And he was asking this question not for himself, but because he was the eldest, and the eldest carries things. Don Esteban opened the top drawer of the desk. He took out the manila envelope and set it on the desk between them. "This is a legal document," he said, "signed by me and 2 witnesses and certified by the licenciada in town. It says that after 5 years of working this ranch, your mother inherits it, the land, the cattle, everything. It is not a gift. It is a payment for work. There is a difference between those 2 things, and I want you to understand it." Tomas looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up. He sat very still. "Can I tell her?" he said. "I was going to tell her this weekend," Don Esteban said. "You may be there when I do." Tomas nodded. He looked at the desk for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you, Don Esteban," in a voice that was level and controlled and cost him something, which Don Esteban could see in the set of his jaw. "Don't thank me," Don Esteban said. "Your mother earned it, and will go on earning it. That is how things should work," he told Marisol on Sunday at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. He set the document in front of her, and she read it carefully, twice, and he sat across from her without speaking. When she finished, she set it down and was quiet for a moment, and he thought she might cry, which he would not have known how to manage, but she did not. She looked up at him with an expression he could not entirely read and said, "This says 5 years." "Yes," he said. "And if you die before 5 years?" "There is a clause," he said. "Read the bottom of the 2nd page." She read it. It said that in the event of Don Esteban's death before the completion of 5 years, the remaining period would be considered fulfilled, provided that the work performed to that point was consistent with the terms of the agreement, which the licenciado was authorized to certify. She read it and set the document down again. "Why?" she said, not accusingly, simply as a question. He thought about how to answer this. He thought about Carmen, who had made 3 rugs for this house, and a half-finished tapete on a loom in a locked room, and he thought about 32 steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, and about a 4-year-old sitting in Carmen's chair looking at the birds on the fence, and about a boy
who had told him about an error in his own accounts without being afraid of the telling.
"Because this land needs someone who loves it," he said, "and I don't intend to leave it to someone who doesn't."
She picked up the document and put it in the pocket of her apron. She got up and refilled his coffee cup without being asked, and she sat back down, and they sat together at the table in the quiet kitchen while the night settled around the house.
It was the 23rd of March. 3 days later, Rodrigo Carrasco drove up the road from Miahuatlan in a silver pickup truck that was newer than anything in the valley and parked in front of the gate. Don Esteban was sitting on the porch when the truck appeared, and he watched it park with the particular attention he gave to things that arrived without announcement. He did not recognize the truck at first. He recognized the walk when the man got out. The walk of someone who has rehearsed casualness and is executing it slightly too well. Rodrigo was 45 and heavy in the shoulders and wore the clothes of a man who worked indoors and wanted to look like he didn't. He carried a pink box from a bakery in Oaxaca, and he was smiling before he was close enough for it to be natural. "Uncle Esteban?" he said, opening the gate without asking.
I was in the area and I thought I would stop by.
Don Esteban was not his uncle, and Miahuatlan was not on the way to anywhere Rodrigo had business, but he said neither of these things. He said, "Rodrigo, come and sit."
They sat on the porch. Rodrigo opened the pink box, which contained pan dulce from a bakery in the city, and set it on the table between them. He talked for 10 minutes about his work in the city, about a property deal he had closed in January, about the road conditions between Oaxaca and the valley. Don Esteban listened and ate a concha from the box and watched Rodrigo's eyes, which were doing something his voice was not. They moved in quick, practiced sweeps across the yard, to the barn, to the cornfield, to the new fence posts along the north pasture that Tomas and Jacinto had replaced in February. They assessed. They did the specific mathematics of a man who knows how much land is worth per hectare in a valley that 3 developers had been calling about for the last 4 years. Then Marisol came out with a tray of coffee cups, and Rodrigo's eyes stopped their sweeping and settled on her with a different kind of attention, calculating in a different register. He said, "I didn't know you had company, Uncle." "Marisol is not company," Don Esteban said. "She runs the household." Rodrigo smiled. Of course. Good to have someone to help. At your age." He looked at Marisol with a friendliness that did not quite reach his eyes and said, "How long have you been here?" 4 months, she said, and went back inside. Rodrigo watched her go and then turned back to Don Esteban with the careful expression of a man arranging his next sentences. He said, "Uncle, I know we haven't been close. That's on me, I know. But I've been thinking about you, living out here alone." "I am not alone," Don Esteban said. Of course not, but people you've only just met, Uncle. You don't know everything about them." "I know what I need to know," Don Esteban said. Rodrigo nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information. He ate a piece of pan dulce. He set his coffee cup down on the pink box, which left a ring, and he did not seem to notice. He said, "I've been meaning to ask, and tell me if this isn't my business, but have you thought about what happens to the ranch? When the time comes, I mean, whether there are arrangements?" He smiled, a smile that was working harder than a smile should have to work. "Family should be involved in these things, you know." Don Esteban looked at the box of pan dulce. He looked at the coffee ring on the lid. He looked out at the yard where Tomas was coming from the north pasture with a fence tool over his shoulder, and where Beto, who had been in the kitchen with Marisol, had just come out onto the porch and stopped when he saw a stranger, and then came and stood quietly beside Don Esteban's chair in the specific way that children stand when they are uncertain about something but certain about who to stand next to. Don Esteban put his hand briefly on top of Beto's head, a thing he had not done before and did without deciding to. "The arrangements have been made," he said.
Rodrigo's smile adjusted slightly.
Made how?
Properly, Don Esteban said, with a licenciada and witnesses and a notary. Every detail. Rodrigo said nothing for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again. Then he said carefully, "Is there anything I should know about? As family?"
You know what you need to know, Don Esteban said.
There was a silence between them that was not comfortable and was not hostile. It was simply clear. Don Esteban ate another concha and watched Tomas pass through the yard toward the barn, and Beto leaned against his knee and said, in the conversational tone he used for all observations, "That man has a very shiny truck." Don Esteban said, "Yes, he does." Rodrigo looked at the boy, and then at Don Esteban, and then stood up and said he had to be getting back. It was a long drive.
And he was glad to see him well, and he would try to visit more often.
He took the pink box of pan dulce with him when he left, which Don Esteban noticed, and which was the most informative thing about the visit. The silver truck went back down the road toward Miahuatlan, and Don Esteban watched it until it was small and then gone. He could not say with certainty what Rodrigo would do next. The man had come to see the situation, and he had seen it. Whether what he had seen would satisfy him or whether it would prompt him to look for some angle not covered by the arrangement, Don Esteban did not know. Rodrigo was not a man of great depth, in his estimation, but shallow men were not always predictable, and he had been in that chair long enough to know that a thing being over was not the same as a thing being finished. Beto reached up and tugged his sleeve. "Can we have dinner now?" he said. "In a little while," Don Esteban said. He sat on the porch for another half hour after the truck had gone, watching the light change on the ridge, and the question he was sitting with was not one he would have been able to name precisely, but it had the quality of a thing that had been set in motion and had not yet found its stopping place. Rodrigo came back in June. He came on a Monday, this time without pan dulce, and he came with a different energy, not the performed casualness of the first visit, but the energy of a man who has had 2 months to think and has decided on something. He parked in the same place, and he walked to the gate, and this time he knocked. Don Esteban was in the office doing the May accounts with Tomas when Lucia came to say that the man with the shiny truck was at the gate again. He told Tomas to finish the column he was working on and then come to the sala, and he went to the door himself. He let Rodrigo in, and he led him to the sala, which was the front room of the house, where Carmen had kept her good furniture and where guests were received. He did not take him to the kitchen, which was where family sat. He sat in the chair across from the sofa and said, "Sit down, Rodrigo." Rodrigo sat. He was wearing a city shirt, and he had brought nothing with him this time, and he did not smile when he came in. He said, "Uncle, I've spoken to a lawyer."
That is your right, Don Esteban said.
"He tells me that an agreement like the one you may have made with a household employee can be challenged if it can be shown that it was made under influence. If you weren't fully in command of your faculties, if someone had access to you in a way that—" "Rodrigo," Don Esteban said. Rodrigo stopped. Don Esteban reached into the pocket of his shirt where he had put the document before answering the door, because he had been expecting this visit or something like it for 8 weeks, and he had spent 2 of those weeks on the phone with Licenciada Morales, and one of them reviewing the specific provisions that addressed exactly what Rodrigo's lawyer had apparently told him. He set the document on the table between them and said, "Read the last clause on the 3rd page." Rodrigo picked it up. He read slowly. Don Esteban watched him read. The clause in question had been drafted at Don Esteban's specific request on the advice of the licenciada after their second conversation in April. It stated that the signatory, Esteban Francisco Ruiz Carrasco, had been evaluated by the licenciada Morales and confirmed to be of full legal capacity and sound mind at the time of signing, that 2 independent witnesses had testified to this, and that any challenge to the agreement on grounds of incapacity or undue influence would require clear and convincing evidence to the contrary.
which evidence did not exist. There was also a provision requiring any challenger to reimburse the legal costs of defending the agreement if the challenge failed, which challenges of this nature, statistically, usually did. Licenciada Morales had said, when she drafted the clause, "You anticipated this." Don Esteban had said, "I anticipated everything. I always anticipate everything. That is why the ranch is still in one piece after 53 years. She had said nothing to this, but she had smiled the smallest professional smile. Rodrigo finished reading the third page and then the fourth, which he read more slowly. He set the document down on the table. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. He was quiet in the way that a man is quiet when the calculation he has been running for several weeks has produced an answer he does not want. "This is a lot of land to give to someone you've known for 4 months, he said at last. Don Esteban looked at him. He thought about Carmen's chair, and the 2 cups in the morning, and the night in the barn, and the tapete on the loom, and the boy with the serious eyes who had found an 8,400 peso error in his books without being asked to look. He thought about Beto standing beside his chair on the porch and saying, without guile or strategy, "Is that for your friend?"
"It is a great deal of land," Don Esteban agreed. "Carmen and I took 50 years to buy it all. I am giving it to someone who will work it the right way and love it the right way, which is what Carmen would have wanted and what I want. The arrangement is legal and sound and witnessed and certified." He picked up the document and returned it to his shirt pocket. "You are welcome to try to challenge it. The licenciada tells me challenges of this kind fail 9 times in 10, and the cost of failing would fall to you. But that is your decision." Rodrigo looked at him for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, Don Esteban had decided, just a practical one, and practicality has its uses, including the use of knowing when something is settled. He said, "She's still just someone who showed up at your gate." Don Esteban said, "Every person I have ever trusted showed up somewhere for the first time. Carmen showed up at a dance in 1969. I asked her to dance and she said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 48 years. He stood up, which he did slowly but without difficulty, using the cane only for the last part of the rise. "I will not keep you. The road back to the city is better in daylight." Rodrigo stood. They walked to the door. At the gate, Rodrigo stopped and turned back, and for a moment, Don Esteban saw something in his face that was not calculation and not strategy, something that might have been, under other circumstances in a different man, regret. "I never came to see you," Rodrigo said, "after Aunt Carmen died. I should have." "Yes," Don Esteban said. "You should have." Rodrigo nodded once and walked to his truck. Don Esteban stood at the gate and watched the silver truck go down the road, and this time it did not feel like a question. It felt like something that had been argued all the way through and had reached its natural end. He went back inside. Tomas was in the sala, sitting in the chair by the window with the accounts notebook in his lap. He had come, as he was told, and he had heard everything, which Don Esteban had intended. The boy set the notebook on the side table and looked at Don Esteban with the expression of someone who is deciding whether to speak. Don Esteban sat down in his chair. "Ask what you want to ask," he said. "Is it over?" Tomas said. "I think so," Don Esteban said. "Men like that don't spend money on lost causes. The cause is lost." He looked at the boy. "Finish the accounts. We have corn to plan for." Tomas picked up the notebook. Outside in the kitchen, Beto was telling Marisol about something that had happened to a beetle in the yard, his voice carrying the usual narrative energy of an important report. The sound of it moved through the house the way sound fills a room that has been empty for a long time. Not loud, just present, which was a different thing entirely. The years did not pass quickly, and they did not pass slowly.
They passed the way years pass on working land, which is to say they were marked by the things that happened in them rather than by the calendar. And when you looked back, you measured them in harvests and repairs and illnesses overcome and animals born and the inch-by-inch growth of the people you were watching grow.
In the first full year, Tomás turned 14 and began managing the monthly accounts without supervision, which Don Esteban certified by signing the ledger with a note in the margin. Entries reviewed and confirmed by E.T.R. Carrasco, accountable to T.V.R. Vega. He had started using that formulation in October, after Tomás asked awkwardly, but directly, if Don Esteban thought he would someday know the land as well as Don Aurelio did. Don Esteban had said, "Don Aurelio has 40 years on you, so probably not until you're 57. But you have better handwriting, and in the long run, that matters more than you think." In the second year, the woman from Teotitlán del Valle came. Her name was Señora Esperanza, and she was 68 years old, and she had been weaving since she was 5. And she came with a small bag and spent 4 days in the ranch, and most of those 4 days were spent in Carmen's room, with Lucia, at the loom, going through the pattern. Don Esteban heard them through the door sometimes, the older woman's voice calm and instructional, Lucia's voice asking questions, the sound of the shuttle and the quiet machinery of the loom. He did not go in. On the morning of the 4th day, Señora Esperanza came to find him in the kitchen and said, "Your wife had a good eye. The pattern is a strong one." He said, "Yes." She said, "The girl has good hands. She will finish it." He said he knew. Lucia finished the tapete in December of that second year, the same month Carmen had planned to finish it, 25 months after it had been left on the loom. She came and got Don Esteban from the porch on a Sunday afternoon and led him to the room without saying what she had done, and he went in and stood in front of the loom, and the tapete was complete, red and terracotta and cream, the nested diamonds that Carmen's mother had taught her, whole and finished and very beautiful, with Lucia's finishing visible in the last quarter of the weaving, which had a slightly different tension than Carmen's portion, tighter, the tension of a hand still learning, but learning well. He stood there for a long time. Lucia stood beside him without speaking, which was exactly right. He said, finally, "We will hang it in the sala." It was hung above the fireplace in the sala on a Tuesday morning, and from that day forward it was the first thing you saw when you walked into the house, and it was both Carmen's and Lucia's, and this was not a contradiction. It was simply what it was. In the 3rd year, Beto started school in Miahuatlán, riding the bus at 6:45 with Tomás, who was now studying accounting at the secondary level and could calculate the cooperative's quarterly adjustments faster than Don Esteban, which Don Esteban acknowledged plainly and without ceremony, which was the highest form of praise he knew how to give. Beto, at 7 years old, had learned to read with the specific intensity of a child who has discovered a door he did not know existed. And he read everything. The backs of seed packages, the labels on pesticide bottles, the agricultural cooperative newsletters that came in the mail, none of which he understood, but all of which he treated with deep respect. He had been calling Don Esteban abuelo for as long as anyone could say with certainty. There was no day it started. There was simply a day when Don Esteban noticed it had been happening for a while, and he did not correct it. In the 4th year, Don Aurelio retired. He was 71, and his hands had been giving him serious trouble for 2 seasons. And the morning he told Don Esteban, standing at the barn door after the early feeding, Don Esteban shook his hand and then held onto it for a moment longer than a handshake required, which was his way of saying what could not be said simply about 32 years of a person being there every morning before daylight. Tomás, who was 17 by then, took over Don Aurelio's work, not replacing him because that was not possible, but doing the work of the position with a capability that made the transition less brutal than it could have been. Jacinto, who was 63 and had no intention of retiring, showed Tomás the things that Don Aurelio had always simply known without being told.
the way you show someone the contents of a map they have been using by feel.
In the fourth year, too, Lucia went to the market in Miahuatlan and sold 4 tapetes that she had woven since the big one. Smaller ones, made in the pattern she was developing for herself, which was related to Carmen's pattern but had its own logic, the way a child's handwriting develops from a model into something personal. She earned 6,000 pesos and came home with the money in a folded envelope and gave it to Marisol, who gave 2,000 of it back and said the rest was the household's.
Lucia put the 2,000 in a jar that she labeled "The Next Loom" in her careful, particular handwriting.
The 5th year arrived the way 5th years do, without announcement, simply the next thing after the 4th, and Don Esteban was 82 years old, and the knee was worse than it had been, requiring a proper crutch now rather than a cane, and his heart had shown 2 cardiologists the particular kind of concern that cardiologists tried to describe without alarming you, and almost succeed.
He was still on the land. He still got up at 4:45. He still poured 2 cups of coffee, but the second one these days he gave to whoever wanted it. Beto, most often, who had decided at some point that coffee was interesting and was being introduced to it incrementally in the way of a child being allowed to taste something adult and important. Don Esteban mixed it half and half with warm milk, and Beto drank it with the gravity of a person conducting a serious tasting, and the cup went from the table into a hand rather than sitting until it went cold. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The legal provisions of the agreement, Licenciada Morales had confirmed at the 4-year mark, had been fully satisfied by the nature and quality of the work performed. She had come to the ranch herself in March, which she did not normally do, and she had walked the land with Don Esteban and with Tomas, and she had looked at the accounts ledger, which was the most meticulous document of its kind she had seen outside a professional firm, and she had said that everything was in order and everything would proceed as written when the time came. Don Esteban had thanked her, and she had stayed for lunch, and Marisol had made mole negro, the way the Valley families made it, with the dry chili and the chocolate from Oaxaca and the turkey from their own coop, and Licenciada Morales had eaten 2 portions, which Don Esteban took as the most complete form of professional approval available. He died in April of the following year, in the bedroom, in the early morning, with the window open. He had known it was coming for 3 weeks. The cardiologist in Oaxaca had told him in March, in the careful and somewhat apologetic way the cardiologists tell people things, that the heart was doing less well than it had been. Don Esteban had thanked him, asked 2 precise questions about what to expect, and taken the bus home. He had told Marisol that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, in the same plain way he had told her things for 5 years, and she had listened, and then put her hand on the table, and he had put his hand next to hers, not touching, but near. He had written some things down. He had written a letter to Licenciada Morales, confirming that the 5 years had been more than satisfied. He had written a letter to his sister in Tehuantepec, which Tomas mailed for him. He had told Don Aurelio by telephone, because Don Aurelio was the person who deserved to be told. He had asked Padre Isidro to come and have lunch, which the Padre did, and they had eaten pozole and talked for 3 hours about water rights and the nature of faith and the price of corn futures. And when the Padre left, he pressed Don Esteban's hands between both of his, and Don Esteban did not feel the need to say anything that was not already said. In the last week, he spent most of his time in the bedroom, sleeping more than he had ever slept, waking in the intervals with a clarity that sometimes comes at the end of things, when the mind has finished being distracted by the future and can simply be where it is. Marisol, or one of the children, were always in the house, and the door to his room was open, and he could hear the house around him. Beto's voice in the kitchen, the radio Lucia had started playing in the evenings, Tomas's footsteps on the porch in the mornings when he went to check the cattle. He had asked Marisol one evening when the children were out to open the window. "The one facing east," he said, "so I can hear the land in the morning." She opened it. He could hear the cattle distantly, and the night birds, and the sound that the wind made in the ceiba tree at the north corner of the yard, which was a sound he had known for 53 years. He died on a Tuesday. Marisol was in the chair beside the bed. Tomas was in the doorway. Lucia was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded, and Beto was asleep on the small rug beside the wardrobe, curled around Carbone, who had come in 3 days ago and refused to be moved. He had not said much in those last days. He had said what he needed to say. But in the early hours of Tuesday, he woke and found Marisol awake in the chair, and he said, clearly enough, in the particular voice of someone who is speaking from a place deeper than habit, "Carmen would have liked you. She always said the land needs to be worked by someone who loves it." Marisol said, "I love it." He said, "I know." He looked out the open window at the sky, which was just beginning to change, the first gray light above the ridge that he had watched for 83 years, and that had never been exactly the same twice. He could see the ceiba tree against the lightening sky, and beyond it the dark shapes of the fence posts, and beyond that, the land. 320 hectares of valley floor and hillside, 60 years of corn, 34 head of cattle, and everything that had happened on it, including Carmen, including Marisol and Tomas and Lucia and Beto, including 50 years of morning coffee and 2 cups and a locked door that was now unlocked, including a half-finished tapete that had been finished by a 9-year-old girl who had good hands and was someone's granddaughter in every way that mattered. He looked at the window, and he breathed out, and the morning came in through the window the way it always had. Tomas registered the inheritance documents with the Miahuatlan registry the following week, with Licenciada Morales present, and the transfer of title was recorded without complication. Rodrigo Carrasco did not file a challenge. Don Esteban had been correct about practical men and lost causes. The corn went in on time that spring because Tomas had already ordered the seed in February, and Jacinto had prepared the field through March. And the work of the land does not pause for grief, but continues alongside it, which is not a cold thing, but a true one. The land was the inheritance, and the inheritance was the work, and the work was what remained. And remaining was not a small thing. Lucia turned 16 that summer and wove 3 more tapetes, each one surer than the last. She sold them through a cooperative in Oaxaca that a woman from Teotitlan del Valle had recommended, and she put half the money in the jar for the loom and gave the rest to Marisol for the house. She had started teaching one of the girls from the neighboring ranch the basics of the diamond pattern, the way Senora Esperanza had taught her, because she said that patterns shouldn't stop with one person. They needed somewhere to go. Beto, who was 9, had developed a serious interest in the cattle, specifically in the question of why certain cows ate more than others while producing the same milk output, which he had read about somewhere and which Jacinto regarded with the tolerant respect of a man who has seen stranger things produce useful ranchers. He followed Jacinto through the pasture in the afternoons with a notebook, writing down observations with the solemnity of an official record keeper. And Jacinto sometimes looked over his shoulder and said, "Write down that number different. It looks like a 7. And Beto would say, "It is a 7. And Jacinto would say, "Then write it like 1. And Beto would write it again. Marisol managed the land the way she had always managed things, practically, without ceremony, with a precision that Don Esteban would have recognized and approved and would not have said so directly, which she also would have recognized and been satisfied by. She kept the kitchen garden. She kept the accounts with Tomas. She kept Don Aurelio's phone number and called him on his birthday and sometimes on days that were not his birthday. She kept the porch chairs where they had always been, and in the morning she made 1 cup of coffee for herself and sat in the chair that had always been hers and looked out at the land that was hers. Not by gift or charity or accident, but by work and by love and by a document signed by a man with precise handwriting and a wooden cane who had known the difference between those things and had thought it important enough to write down. The tapete hung above the fireplace in the sala, red and terracotta and cream, the nested diamonds that were older than anyone alive could say. When the morning light came through the east window at the right angle, which happened between 7 and 7:30 for about 6 weeks in the spring, the colors were exactly the colors of the land in that season. The deep soil of the valley and the pale highland grasses and the terracotta of the old roof tiles. And you could see, if you looked,
where one person's weaving ended and another person's began. And you could see that the difference was small, and that both portions were part of the same whole, and that the whole was beautiful because of the work, and not despite the interruption.
So tell me, which moment touched your heart the most? Was it the morning Beto climbed into Carmen's chair and asked about the friend whose coffee was going cold on the table? Was it the afternoon Lucia walked into the locked room and stood before the unfinished tapete and said simply, "Could someone finish it?" Or was it that last Tuesday morning when Don Esteban looked out the open window at the land he had built with his hands and the family that had come to him at a gate and said,
Without ceremony, I know.
Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this story found you at the right moment, subscribe to Alma and Historias, because there is always a story waiting for you here.